in our last time together into the New Testament. What I want to do today is look really at two data sets. That is, again, the biblical data set, and in particular, to kind of camp on the prophet Isaiah, his life, his ministry, and his message. Isaiah is a beautiful book, and the ministry and message of the prophet is a lovely, lovely message. It's the second most quoted book in the New Testament, I think in part because of its salient and pointed theological claims about who God is. And so I want to come back to that theological message of Isaiah. But I want to tell the story of Isaiah's lifetime, and we're going to build really to 1 year in Isaiah's lifetime, 701 BC, because we have a mass of archaeological data and historical data that comes to us from this period in history. It's really incredible. We're talking about thousands of texts, monumental palaces, dozens of excavations, probably tens of thousands of artifacts that converge with the biblical story here. Now, I know we have about 40, 45 minutes, so I'm not going to touch all of that. I'm going to try to weave it together and just tell you the story, to tell you the story of Isaiah, and on the other hand, the Assyrians. The Assyrians. And so what I want in general is to think of our story today as the story of Isaiah set to the drumbeat of Assyrian imperialism. Assyrian imperialism. Or to think of it another way, to think of the crises precipitated by the Assyrians for Isaiah, for the kingdom of Judah, for the king of Judah, Hezekiah. Now, we talked our first week together about this doctrine or teaching of organic inspiration. And I joked and I jest that organic is nice because it conjures all sorts of images. Natural. God used those things which were natural to communicate who he is. The natural thing in Isaiah's world that God's using, that thing that's just there, that God's using to communicate who he is the Assyrians, the geopolitics of the period. So as we unpack and we learn about the Assyrians, the crises that the Assyrians represent, of course, there are no Assyrians today. Right? Well, there are, actually. Chicago's a large community for them. But they're not a major imperial power. They are not the crisis of our era. And so we'll have to think about how we can translate Isaiah's message into one that's relevant for the contemporary period. We'll come back to it at the end, but I want to begin with the story. And when we think about Isaiah, when we think about the king, Hezekiah, the king in Jerusalem during Isaiah's lifetime, we need to note that we're about 200 years or so, maybe a little more, forward in history from where we were last time with Solomon. We talked about the splendor of Solomon, the glory of this palace, and the ways in which he was adopting and adapting all sorts of cultural symbols to the world of Israel, and how that presented a challenge for the people of God to be in the world in which they lived, but not of that world. We're 200 and 250 years later. Things have dramatically changed. In fact, they dramatically change immediately after Solomon dies. 5 years after he dies, the Egyptians come through and strip all of the glory and splendor from the palace and temple, and it's gone. And the rest of the history of Israel and Judah is framed by two kingdoms. Solomon's single kingdom, now you're looking at what is today modern-day Israel-Palestine, right? Here's the north, it's slightly angled. Here's the south, we're headed down toward Egypt this way, just to orient you on the map. It's split into two kingdoms. The kingdom of Israel here, represented in the north at the center, the political center of Samaria, and the kingdom of Judah in the south, represented with its political center at Jerusalem. Isaiah belongs to this world. He lives in Jerusalem. He's next door neighbors with the king in Jerusalem. And we're going to work with this template as we go forward in history and think about the crises, the threat that the Assyrians represent for us. As we do, I don't like to put a lot of text on slides because it's boring to look at, right? You have to hear me say these things. But these are strange words. 3 kings I want you to know from the archaeological record, from the history of the Assyrians. And I'm just going to put them up there in case you're like me and it helps to see them as well as hear them. The first king is a guy named Shalmaneser. The second one, a guy named Sargon. And the third one, where we're going to camp and spend most of our time, is with a guy named Sennacherib. And all I want to do is simply tell you the political history in a nutshell of the Assyrians and how they build up to and present the crises that they do that we find in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Kings. So that's where we're going. That's where we're going. Let's start with Shalmaneser, and I'll just simply paint that picture with a couple of artifacts. Here's a photo from the British Museum of what is often referred to as the Black Obelisk. It's a beautiful diorite stone monument. It stands about 7.5 or 8 feet tall. It's there, as you can see in the background, as is the case in the British Museum, amidst so many other wonderful artifacts, it almost gets lost. But this one stands out as important for biblical history and for the intersections between biblical and Assyrian history. This artifact, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here, dates from the middle of the 9th century BC, circa 841 or so. And it's a monument that's erected by this guy, Shalmaneser III, and tells the story of how he's conquering and campaigning out of the heartland of Assyria, which today you hear all the time about in the news. It's near Kirkuk, Nineveh, right? Kirkuk, Nineveh, right down the river, one from the other. How he's campaigning out of the heartland of Assyria as far as into places like Israel and Palestine. And one particular, as you can see, several different registers of art and all sorts of text inscribed thereon. Nice close-up. One of these, in particular, is important for biblical history and presents a nice, I think, visual image of what we read in the biblical text. Namely, here you can see Shalmaneser standing, and there you can see this poor guy here, who now is a vassal king and happens to be one of the kings of Israel, paying homage and tribute to the Assyrians. This, in the middle of the 9th century, becomes really the first moment where we hear the slow, but what's going to become increasingly steady, drumbeat of the Assyrian imperialism as it spreads to the west from Kirkuk, from modern-day Iraq or Kurdistan today. And this, of course, is our visual image as we think about it. As we move forward in time, Shalmaneser is going to carve out a kingdom roughly coterminous here with what you see in the green. We're going to see the Assyrian monarchs become more and more efficient as military and imperial force in the ancient world. One of the things that happens is they institute a series of reforms. One of these reforms is the standing army. A standing army. Prior to this, the army had largely been draft or corvée. But now we have a standing army. And standing armies are incredibly efficient in that you can go to war at a moment's notice. You're prepared. You don't have to take the time to draft, to get everybody in place, inventory them, provision them, and then go to. They're already there. They also become incredibly challenging because you now have a motley crew of military people waiting around to do something. And they are expensive to keep. And so one of the unintended consequences of the standing army is that a standing army needs to be not standing but moving. Right? And the Assyrians become incredibly adept at warfare. They also set up the infrastructure for warfare. What we know today, of course, as the U.S. Postal Service, the Pony Express and its predecessors, finds its origins in the Assyrian army, where they set up outposts with fresh men and fresh horses, to carry messages from northern Iraq, ultimately all the way down to near the border with Sudan, within a day or two, in order to keep information moving for the armies. They're also going to establish a series of governors over their newly conquered territories, which not long after Shalmaneser will extend all the way down to the border with what is today modern-day Israel, into what is today Lebanon and Syria. They'll establish governors who are eunuchs. This is going to make sure that those governors have nothing in mind but the interest of the king. That is to say, they don't have in mind the interest of progeny or a family legacy developing. It's a streamlined and efficient imperial machine. And it's going to spread quickly. I want you to feel in measure, us to understand a little bit better the crises Assyria presents for Judah. This is what's going to happen over about 100 years in this history leading up to Isaiah, ultimately culminating in my little fire here, right? Ultimately culminating in what we know in the biblical story of our other Assyrian king, Sargon II. Sargon II comes to the throne, and he decides he's going to continue to expand. Ultimately, the goal for the Assyrians is to make it all the way into Egypt. the wealth of Egypt. And standing in the way is Israel-Palestine. And so the next stop for Sargon becomes the capital city of Samaria and the kingdom of Israel. And the biblical text tells us, and Sargon's records recount, how after 3 years of sieging the city, it falls. And this is a dark day. This is a dramatic and traumatic moment in the history of God's people. Because now we've gone from what we talked about last week, under Solomon, this kingdom, a nation that's like the great nations of the earth, to a nation that's split into two after civil war, and half of it's now gone. In fact, half of it's taken into exile and enslaved. This happens during the lifetime of Isaiah. As he's younger, he's watching the status quo of two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, now reduced to just Judah. Judah stands alone. This is the early ministry of Isaiah. Sargon's important for us, and I want you to see he, of course, conquers here in the red all the way down to Samaria, and you can see Judah's the next domino to fall, right? The objective is to go down to Egypt. But he also is going to conquer far and wide to the east and to the south in what is today southern Iraq as well, and into really central Anatolia or Turkey. He's a massive campaigner. Sargon pushes the borders of the Assyrian Empire to its greatest limits at this moment in history. Sargon also undertakes enormous building projects. And I have to note these because we're here in Chicago. If you were to go down to the Oriental Institute, you can actually see one of the building projects Sargon the Great invests in. They have there this throne room of Sargon that he constructs, and he uses exiles like those from Israel to help construct. And this massive 32-ton, 16-foot tall composite creature that's standing in the back of the museum there, you can see it's a rather imposing and remarkable thing. Sargon is going to spend about 10 years on these building projects. 10 years on these building projects. He starts in, I know dates, nobody likes dates, but just so you understand, the 10 years is kind of important. He starts in about 713 or 714 BC. And he's really going to stop going on military campaigns for 10 years because he's invested in this building project. This is important. This 10-year window is significant. Because if you're the king in Judah, whose name is Hezekiah, and you've watched the first part of Sargon's reign, and you've watched his empire expand to this, and you happen to live right here, it doesn't take, a great deal of mathematical calculation to figure out what Sargon's next move is probably going to be. You're next. You're in the sights of Assyria. And so while Sargon goes back to his heartland, and he's building a capital city, a new capital city, spending some of the capital that he's captured, Hezekiah says, I know what I need to do. I need to prepare. And so Hezekiah, recognizing he's in the sights of Assyria, sets his hands to elaborate preparations for the Assyrian onslaught. Now Hezekiah, he occupies a piece of real estate that's rather small compared to, as you saw, the Assyrian Empire. He has no delusions that he's going to marshal an army, march to Kirkuk, and defeat the Assyrians. Rather, he takes, I think, what is the pragmatic or practical option. He's going to win a war of attrition. Make it so that he's just not worth going to war against. Maybe the Assyrians will go around us on the way to Egypt. And so Hezekiah sets forward with that task in mind. Now, he has the advantage of 10 years. He's going to have 10 years, as we'll see, to prepare for this battle, for this war of attrition. He also has several, we'll say, mixed challenges. As I just mentioned, Sargon captures the northern kingdom of Israel. What happens in the decimation, the wake of this conquest? Well, we have massive floods of refugees who've now undergone, all of the horrors of the war, the fall of Samaria, and people who are living in the countryside who are going to now flee just a few kilometers south so that they're outside of the Assyrian control. They speak Hebrew. The people in Judah speak Hebrew. It's a rather easy, simple transition. We see this influx of refugees in the archaeological record. At many sites, for our purposes, most notably Jerusalem, and I promise to explain to you what you're looking at here, you're looking at in the black what is the city of David, or the city of Jerusalem, really up until Hezekiah's reign. However, at a number of sites after this event where Samaria falls, we see massive explosion in population, refugee camps that pop up, essentially, such that in Jerusalem now, this area here, off on the left-hand side of your screen on the western side, 4/5 of the city of Jerusalem after the fall of Samaria is new from refugees. Now this presents a formidable challenge. Remember, your goal as Hezekiah is to win a war of attrition. If 4/5 of your population lives outside your city walls, it's going to be rather difficult or challenging to watch 4/5 of your population vulnerable when the Assyrians come marching through. So we see Hezekiah begin to make significant preparations, the first of which, archaeologically, we see is this construction of a wall that follows our green line here around that new population. It's built in haste. You can't quite see it here. It's a little bit easier to see in person. This runs through the old city of Jerusalem today, where they just sort of decided, after excavating, leave it, put a railing around it. But it's a 21-foot thick, solid stone, limestone wall. And underneath it are a series of houses, which were quickly torn down so that they could build the wall. Right? Eminent domain. We got to get this thing up. He fortifies the city of Jerusalem. He wants to win a war of attrition. Of course, he has another problem as well. We talked, or at least alluded to it last week. There's a spring in Jerusalem. It's called the Gihon Spring. And that spring ran down to a pool of water here where everyone in Jerusalem would have gone out to collect and gather the water. What's the obvious problem? It's outside the city walls. That's going to be great for furnishing the Assyrians with all the water they need, but not so good again at winning that war of attrition. Hezekiah sets his hand to change this. And today, in fact, you can see this. He carves into the mountain what is roughly 2/3 of a mile long, following a natural fissure or crack in the rock, a tunnel to bring water from the source now to a new pool in the city. And it's all subterranean, or you can kind of see these elevation marks. It goes into the mountain. If you go to Jerusalem today, in fact, there's my kids and I, we walked through it this summer. It's narrow. It gives you a sense of how narrow it is. But bringing water into the city, we're going to win that war of attrition. We're preparing for the war of attrition. We know this is Hezekiah. How you ask, how do you know a cave dates to the time of Hezekiah? About 1/3 of the way into the tunnel is found, back during the Ottoman occupation of Palestine, an inscription written in classical Hebrew from the time of Isaiah and Hezekiah, talking about the construction of this particular tunnel, describing in sort of poetic fashion how there was one group following the fissure from this side and the other, and then pickaxe hit pickaxe, and the water began to flow. And it's a joyous moment for the people of Jerusalem, no doubt, because they're rather high on their horse now. We can win the war of attrition. We also begin to see in the archaeological record, what are you looking at, right? What is this? My students sometimes sort of, I think, their jaws drop. Another slide of something I have no idea what it is. But what it is actually is a jar handle. And I've given you the jar. There's the jar. You can see the handle here. And on the jar handle is an impression. Now, there are thousands of this impression found in Judah from this moment in time, from Hezekiah. It reads in Hebrew, belonging to the king, and then it has one of 4 cities from Judah stamped on it. All right? Before there was Walmart's central distribution plan, there was Hezekiah's. There was Hezekiah's. There are 4 cities marked on these, and these are 4 cities corresponding to the 4 districts of the kingdom of Judah. One of them is Ziph off in the wilderness, one of them is Hebron in the hill country, one of them is Soko off in what's called the lowlands or the Shephelah, and one's down from the Negev. Studies of these pottery and the pottery composition and the ceilings themselves, as I said, there's thousands of these, show that they're being centrally made in the environs of Jerusalem. And what they are is they're providing 4 places within the kingdom where they can send supplies. Again, what's the rationale for the supplies? When the Assyrians come, we need a central distribution that's going to deal with all of the country in this area, in this area, in this area. Thousands of these. Vestiges of this system, the preparations for war by Hezekiah. Hezekiah does other things too, and this is now where we begin to find even closer connections with Isaiah. Broad wall. We have the water system. We have this system of redistribution. We also have Hezekiah very plainly from the biblical text beginning to reach out for international help, right? To build this coalition, which includes two kingdoms, Egypt and Babylon, both of which show up in the book of Isaiah. And I have to note what Isaiah says about them, because now we begin to foreshadow, gesture toward what Isaiah is going to say about the events to follow. Egypt, I love this, right? Egypt's help is useless. I call her a do-nothing dragon. Isaiah knows the imagery of Egypt well. He's alluding to the serpent on the uraeus on the head of the Pharaoh, right? The dragon on the head of the Pharaoh. Or the Egyptians are flesh. They're not God. Evoking the idea that the Pharaoh is somehow the son of God. And Isaiah says, no, he's polemicizing. We'll get there, I promise. But it's part of that prophetic critique. We also have, of course, at that time, the book of Kings, and Isaiah tells us the same story, that Marduk-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, there's that guy right there. That's Marduk-Baladan. Sends an envoy to Jerusalem and says, hey, you know what? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's a classic political move, right? I'm not necessarily friends with Judah as king of Babylon, but I don't like Assyria, and they don't like Assyria. And so we're friends now, right? And so the envoy comes from Babylon. And what does Hezekiah do? He shows him everything that he has, how wealthy and powerful he is. Why? Because he wants to be seen as a worthy ally in this fight that they're going to go in on together. Hezekiah's preparations for war. We have a broad wall. We're refortifying. We're bringing water into the city. We have a new system to prepare, this redistribution system, and we have now international alliances. 10 years to do it all, and Hezekiah pulls it off. Then, in 705 BC, remember I said Sargon starts around 714 or so building his capital? In 705 BC, Sargon goes off to a little small petty skirmish near his capital, and in the prime of his life, is killed in battle. This is read by everyone under the thumb of Assyria in the Middle East as the moment to throw off the Assyrian imperial power. And so the Babylonians, the Egyptians, Judah decide. The revolution begins. And the new king who comes to the throne, he's that third one. We talked about Shalmaneser. We talked about Sargon. Sennacherib. Right? I know it seems like they couldn't have any stranger names, but Sennacherib comes to the throne and slowly but surely begins to deal with the rebellions in his empire. First, he campaigns to Babylon, which is going to be a smashing success for him. He actually floods the city of Babylon, decimates it. The city of Babylon grows to hate Sennacherib, and centuries later will still hate him because he deals such a smashing victory against Babylon. After Babylon, he turns to Judah. And the book of Isaiah recounts how Sennacherib moves against Judah. In chapter 36, it says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Sennacherib, if you again go down to the Oriental Institute, there's this, I'll show you a slide. I think I have a slide in just a bit. There's a beautiful clay prism that tells about his campaign against Judah. It's a stupendous find. We know so much about this battle against Hezekiah. We know it from Herodotus. We know it from Josephus, the biblical text, from Sennacherib. And as I'll show you in just a second, we know it from the archaeological record in Nineveh too. Because Sennacherib goes against all the fortified cities of Judah. According to Sennacherib's account, 46 of them. And there's one in particular that he's really stoked that he wins at. It's the city of Lachish, or Lachish. Lachish. It's the southernmost city in Judah. Remember, the goal is to get to Egypt. And it's the second largest city in Judah. Most heavily fortified, second most heavily behind Jerusalem. And so Sennacherib is going to spend a great deal of time there in 701 BC. And I want to talk a little bit about what happens in 701 BC. Now what are you looking at? My goodness. This is a schematic of the throne room of Sennacherib as it was uncovered by archaeologists, British archaeologists in the past century, in Nineveh. His throne room, which you would have entered in this way, the king would have sat here. And this throne room told a story. Sennacherib, when he was having it built, decided, hey, what story should I tell? I should tell the story of how I won the battle at the city of Lachish against King Hezekiah of Judah. And so when you went in, the wallpaper, so to speak, and texts told that story. I'm going to show you how he told it. So it's not wallpaper, it's beautiful, large limestone friezes that are carved. You can see them in the British Museum if you ever have the chance to go. You entered into this throne room, past a series of, and these are actually drawings of what you'd see at the OI today, what are called lamasu, or these large winged bulls. The one, again, at the OI is 32 tons, 16 feet tall, huge. There were 6 of them. And Sennacherib, actually a bit of an artist himself, is playing with perspective. 6 of them in which each is 2 feet smaller than the next to make the corridor look a little bit longer and a little more imposing. Nothing like art in the service of despotism, right? But in any event, you would have walked in and you would have seen this large set of friezes, limestone friezes. I'll show them to you in just a moment. They're taller than me, about 8 feet tall. You walk to the British Museum, they're rather remarkable to take in. That told the story of how Sennacherib led the Assyrian army down to Lachish, down against Hezekiah, and how he decimates the city. And he shows this story beginning with the infantry. Here you can see one of those limestone reliefs, and I'll show you some details in a second, but you'll notice off over here you have these guys look like they're carrying sticks, these others who are clearly carrying bows. These are those least proximate, furthest away from the city walls. So he's starting with the battlefield furthest away from the city, and he's going to move increasingly closer to the city, and ultimately he's going to show you himself and all of the plunder being led to him. Just to give you a close-up here, you can see these slingers. These are the Assyrian soldiers throwing their sling stones at the city of Lachish. I put on a couple of tables these rocks. These are actually Assyrian sling stones, just to give you a sense of the size of them, right? You can pass them around. They're not really that extraordinary, except for that they're rocks that were found, and we have thousands of these in the archaeological record. The city of Lachish has been excavated. Thousands of sling stones are found, right? Thousands of arrowheads are found, testifying to this battle that transpires, the heat of battle that's transpiring at this site. This is the crisis of Assyria for Isaiah, for Hezekiah. I like the sling stones too for the David and Goliath. When I was a kid, we used to sing in. Do you remember, I don't know if you know this, but when I was a kid, we used to sing Only a Boy Named David, Only a Rippling Brook, Only a Boy Named David, 5 little stones he took. And these really aren't little stones, right? They're the size of a baseball, to bring this discussion full circle. In any event, I just want to give you a sense, and in fact, this is replicated through anthropological experimental archaeology today. These slings are moving something on the order of 150 meters, or over 400 feet, with incredible accuracy too, mind you. There was one study done with some Arabs and youth in Palestine. They can hit a stick at about that distance. Pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. We're moving in our narrative, though, from the most remote parts of the battle ultimately to the city. What I want you to walk away with and appreciate here is the crisis of Assyria for Isaiah. Because Isaiah is going to speak into that crisis. There's where his message is timeless. He also is going to talk about that more immediate siege of the city, the battle itself. And there in the battle, here you can see the relief. It's stylized to be sure, but you can see these ramps, and I'll show you some more details. Ramps with siege engines and all sorts of troops moving up against the city. Here's a nice detail of it. You'll see these wonderful siege ramps, right? And you can see the siege engines. I grant they're stylized. They're as big as the city itself. But that's Lachish. That's Lachish. Sennacherib's telling the story of Lachish. And the drama of the battle is captured remarkably. This is one of my favorite slides. It's actually not from the Battle of Lachish, but it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. Right? You're looking at that Assyrian siege engine here. You're seeing these siege ramps. Who's building the siege ramps, after all, up to the city wall? These are the slaves of Judah who are caught on the way, right? Because then you put that incredible moral dilemma before the people of Lachish. Do I kill my neighbor, or do I let the Assyrians breach the city walls? It's a tried and true tactic the Romans will use later as well. But I love this. Here's the siege engine off over here. Do you see this? What looks like a siege engine over here? And do you see the battering ram part coming out? Yes, okay. So you have people shooting at the walls from the top and from below. You have the battering ram going out, and then what in the world is this? These are chains that are dropped down from people on the city wall trying to break that battering ram, to disable it. Only, of course, the counter tactic is there are people with grappling hooks trying to release the chains, trying to break the battering ram. Moreover, you have people here what look like you're not quite sure what's coming out here from these two sets of hands. There's a set of hands there. Do you see that? It's hot tar, so that the battering ram catches fire. Another way, only that's being countered by water coming out of the battering ram. All the while, two guys are tunneling under the wall over here. The heat of the battle. The Assyrian king wants you to feel the heat of the battle as you come to see him, and in particular, his battle at Lachish. Ultimately, he shows precisely what we find in the archaeological record. Siege ramps galore leading up to the city of Lachish, arrowheads, sling stones, etc. He shows how he wins the battle and how the plunder and the people are led out of the city. These are your Judeans of the city of Lachish, some of which children, right? Families, bringing what they have, and in procession in this case, all of them being led before their Sennacherib himself, seated on the throne, the king, who's now conquered almost to Egypt. Last stop to Egypt is Lachish. And this relief, there you can see another detail of it. Here's some of the families that are being led out of the city of Lachish. All of it's being led as plunder for the king, Sennacherib. And those who resist, as they go to do obeisance before the king, are impaled. And so when you go visit Sennacherib in Nineveh, you see this. You're reminded of the crisis. He wants you to see his formidable power. And this is what Isaiah is living through in Jerusalem, as Sennacherib's conquering 46 cities in Judah. Archaeologically, we actually have tombs, mass tombs, more than 1,500 bodies in this tomb disarticulated from the battle. Probably those Judeans that you saw impaled, or others who are dying in this battle. I could go through rather lengthy statistics with you, but Judah is decimated. Population's probably halved in the country because of this. Because of this. There's another close-up of it. There's Sennacherib's prism. You'll see it if you go down to the Oriental Institute. Yay big. It tells his side of the story. It tells his side of the story. Isaiah tells us the king of Assyria sent his commander after the battle of Lachish up to Jerusalem. Sennacherib tells us, I sent my commander up to Jerusalem after the battle of Lachish. Because now, it's as if there is no bargaining chip at all for Hezekiah. Second largest city's fallen. 45 others have. What's left but Jerusalem, the small cow town in the hill country? That's it. And that's where Isaiah and his prophecy, his message, screams into a world, his own world, the world of Jerusalem, the world of Judah, of how this crisis cannot shape the perspective of the people of God. There's hope in the night, Isaiah says. There's hope in this deep, dark night. And I ask the question, right, just simply to prod you, to reflect, to think on this. We don't have an Assyria today, but we all have dark nights. Personal, dark nights. We know them collectively. Isaiah's message in this sense, I think, is timeless. And I want us to begin to hear that prophetic message. Before I do, I want to stop. I know I've gone through an enormous amount of material and I have just a couple minutes, but to give you a second to ask any questions. Keep going. All right. All right. Well, I want to tell the story as the Rabshakeh, or the general of the Assyrians, arrives in Jerusalem. Hezekiah is prepared, right? He's got a broad wall. He's got water in the city. The Rabshakeh begins to speak to the people of Jerusalem in Hebrew. And the elders of the city come to the city walls and they say, do you mind speaking with us in the imperial language? We don't want to speak Hebrew, because if you speak Hebrew, it's really going to freak out the people living in the city wall. You are not saying good things. You don't bring good reports. You bring reports of 46 cities decimated, of populations killed. We don't want the people of Jerusalem to freak out. Speak to us in the imperial language. We can speak that. The writer of Kings, the writer of Isaiah, I think tell us this just to show us the darkness of the people of God at this moment in time. And now we have three accounts, one that's silent, one that's more elaborate, and the biblical account of what transpires next. Isaiah tells us this. It's crazy. It's completely polemical, and it's opposite everything you would expect or want if you were a political prognosticator. If you were a betting person at this moment in time, you'd say, yeah, the Assyrians, this is another capital city that's going to fall. That's what the general of the Assyrians says. He says, what makes you think, Hezekiah, you're going to be able to win a war of attrition against me? And he goes down the list of all the kingdoms he's conquered. That map spreading like an oil stain, inevitable. And Isaiah the prophet says, wait, there's something different. It's the God that's different here. And Isaiah says, look, virgin daughter Zion, that's Jerusalem, despises and mocks you, Sennacherib. Whoa. Completely and utterly counterintuitive. Daughter Jerusalem tosses her head as you flee. Who is it you've ridiculed and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel, Yahweh. And Isaiah says to the people of God, God is a God who keeps his promises. He's going to deliver you in this instance. And Isaiah is remembering the promises of Yahweh made to David, to Jerusalem, even in his own lifetime, that he's going to deliver Jerusalem. And juxtaposes Yahweh with Sennacherib. Isaiah goes on to tell the story of how Sennacherib, you're going to flee from Jerusalem. You're going to be killed by your children. Now here's where our three stories converge. Sennacherib tells us he confined Hezekiah like a bird in a cage in his city, Jerusalem. And doesn't, he's silent, say he ever captured the city. Moreover, his throne room reflects on the capture of what? Lachish, not Jerusalem. He doesn't capture Jerusalem. We know it historically. Herodotus tells us a plague broke out in the Assyrian camp because of mice. Isaiah tells us Yahweh intervened and sent Sennacherib home with his tail between his legs. And Sennacherib's successor tells us, just as Isaiah had predicted, that Sennacherib would be killed by his children, which he is. It's a famous letter, cuneiform letter, that describes the trial of the assassination of Sennacherib, the assassinator of Sennacherib. These stories converge. The archaeological record, I think, helps us to see. We don't have Assyrians in our day. We don't have Assyrians in our day. But the God of Isaiah is a God we can trust in deep, dark nights, whatever they may be. Personal, family, marriages, work, and unemployment. There's a God, Isaiah's God, who's trustworthy. And I think this is the timeless translation of Isaiah's message. Are there any questions or comments or concerns?
Why did Sennacherib's children kill him?
Well, there's a real contest after Sennacherib for as is often the case for succession. There's always that sort of clawing for power, and that's precisely what happens. He has several sons, and in fact, it's a rather devious thing the way it all works out. The letter is it's a juicy letter in which, there's a plot against Sennacherib, and Sennacherib's actually almost informed of it, but this guy informs the son who's actually behind the assassination, and the son says, hey, wait, let's put a bag over this guy's head, and let's make sure we tell him we're going to take him to the king. Put a bag over his head. They actually take him to the conspirator himself, the son who's trying to kill him, and says, oh, tell me what's going to happen. And then when he says, there's going to be a conspiracy to kill Sennacherib, he says, yep, you're right, and he kills him. And then it happens. So, I mean, this is all from the Assyrian records themselves. So it's a rather remarkable story, but it's classic self-interest and clawing for power. Yeah.
In your fascinating history
Yeah.
and reconstruction, I think there is a vacuum because we arrived at a point where we really don't know what happened. Did the Assyrian have a battle? Did the Assyrian try to conquer Jerusalem, or they retreated without fight?
Yeah, I think you're right. The question of what exactly transpires on the ground in Jerusalem, I don't have an answer for you. What I can say is Sennacherib tells us he sent a general up there, and that there's troops up there. The biblical text tells us there's troops up there. Later classical sources tell us there's troops up there. I'm content with that much and saying that much. I would also say the other given in the historical reconstruction is that those troops go home and Jerusalem stays. So beyond that, I'm not entirely sure. I'm quite comfortable with the harmonization personally. Now, granted, it's a harmonization that acts from a very specific presupposition that I do think Yahweh intervenes. But I'm quite comfortable with the ideas of Josephus and others who say a plague of mice break out in the camp. If that's how God's intervening, that's how God's intervening. But the end result being the same, however you put these stories together, it's conspicuous that the Assyrian king does not say, I took Jerusalem. The Assyrian kings are not modest for the sake of modesty, right? They're always doing a bit of chest pounding and bravado. So that they say they capture Lachish and not Jerusalem, as one person's put it, the Assyrians never lost battles. They just won them closer and closer to their capital. So even in the last gasping breaths of their empire, they're winning, right? They're always winning. So I think these things are telling, and they kind of give us a rough portrait, an impression. So I think you're right. It's a good point. I can't give you the particulars. But there's a convergence of stories that give a sense of what's going on. So I think it's a good observation. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Go ahead. Well, today Assyria, the term Syria, the country, actually comes from the Greeks who remembered vaguely the Assyrians lived there but couldn't quite get it out right. That is that region. Today it's eastern Syria, northern Iraq, or Kurdistan. Sometimes it's referred to today. There are people who hearken from the Assyrians ethnically, and in fact Chicago is one of the largest populations of them, but they're not a people with the land anymore. They tend to sort of remember it, but not have a political voice that's instantiated in the state. Yes?
Is it not possible that you might find in the archaeological uncovered portion some documentation that might generate an answer to this gentleman's question?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, part of what's fascinating for me about archaeology is it's not a closed data set. There's always more data coming out, and we're having to refashion and sometimes it's data you're like, whoa, would have never thought about that being the case. And then you have to see how it all fits together in a totally new way. So I think these sorts of questions are great questions. And that's why archaeological investigation is important, is it's giving us new data to try to think through these issues in more complicated and sophisticated ways. So, yes? You're kind, you're kind. Thank you so much.